I do remember when I was very, very, very young. I would have been about 5 or 6 years old. I think I was six actually. We got our first computer. This is a strange thing, especially for those of you who were sort of born maybe after the 1980s. It's sort of in the mid to late 1990s or after that. But I've discussed this with my colleague Kit Power quite a lot. We're part of a very strange generation that's sort of like what are sometimes called the Xennials. You know, those millennials who were born on the interim in that weird liminal space between the Generation X and the millennials. So we do recall a time very vaguely before there was an electronic entertainment at home, before there were digital devices in the home setting. For the first 5 years of my life, there were no computers at home, nothing, and no mobile phones or anything like that. The internet wasn't a thing. It was a very strange time. It was a very strange period. The first computer I had was a British computer called the Commodore Amiga, which was very successful, really big in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Massively successful computer. Very powerful for its time. It was very much the antecedent to home computers, PCs, effectively, in that it wasn't just a gaming platform. It was a gaming platform, and a really powerful one at that. But it was also a very adult instrument or device, in the sense that it had things like a Windows system, a very early Windows system called the Workbench. It had word processing on it, which was revolutionary at the time. It had painting programs on it, again, kind of revolutionary at the time. It had programs that allowed you to create animations and games of your own, and to code games of your own and stuff like that. It was really revolutionary. I remember it was my introduction to computers in general, to technology like the one that I'm recording on now. It was really strange. It's really strange to think of, but that was it. That was my introduction. Now, by that point, I'd already started to develop a taste for horror, simply because there was so much around. There was, it was the 1980s, so it's hard to describe to you, if you were not around at the time, what it was like. Largely Stephen King, but a lot of others as well, had created this horror boom, whereby in publishing, in comic books, in cinema, it was big business. It was massive business. You also had the VHS market, which was new at the time, so home media itself was blooming at the time. And video games and computers and video game consoles were part of that. But the funny thing about video games is, although there were horror video games, they were very few and far between, simply because video games at the time were still a new medium. They were a very new medium, very young. People didn't really understand them, and older generations were very frightened of them. They certainly became the target of, as per usual, right-wing smears and exaggerations and distortions and outright fucking lies, by the way. The UK tabloids, I mean, they feasted off of the subject of video games, like instilling and evoking terror of video games in older generations for a long time, and almost everything they printed was absolute bullshit, because it was written almost exclusively by people who never played video games, so they knew not of which they spoke. Anywho, horror did exist, but it was very niche and very difficult to get. Like the consoles, the video game consoles, horror they were very rarely marketed as horror video games, because they would have caused an uproar if they were. Rather, you had things like, for example, the Contra series on the Super Nintendo that had horrific elements and images in it, but was not necessarily a horror video game. Things like Super Metroid, which had elements that were inspired by the likes of Ridley Scott's Alien, for example, but which was not marketed as a horror video game. On the Amiga, it was a bit different, because the Amiga was it was marketed at a slightly more adult audience. So yes, you had like your colourful platform video games, games aimed at young children, but you also had an adult market, which was rare at the time. It was unusual at the time. So you had dedicated horror games, and one of my exposure to horror in video games came through that. It was very odd, but like it didn't occur to me until I got a horror video game that you could do horror in video games. That was just like, it didn't occur to me at all. For me, at the time, video games were more cutesy. It was things like the actual pack that I got. There were these big packages that you could get of the Commodore Amiga that had like suites of video games with them, and the one I got was called the Cartoon Classics. So it had these cutesy platform games with it. It had an adaptation of all bloody things, Captain Planet and the Planeteers, and if you were around in the 1990s, you know exactly what the fuck that was. It had a video game adaptation of The Simpsons, which Bart versus the Space Mutants, which was huge at the time. The Simpsons were in their ascendancy at that time. They were enormous. They were in every media. There was Simpsons material everywhere. You just couldn't move for The Simpsons back then, so video games were an obvious one. And they're all kind of cutesy platformers, for the most part. There was nothing really that disturbing or anything like that amongst them. But as my time with the Amiga went on, and I started to get like the magazines, the video game magazines that had reviews and things in them, but also cover discs. You used to be able, this is before the internet, so there was no way of downloading things or anything like that. But what happened was you got video game cover discs, which were floppy discs that were sellotaped to the front of magazines. And we used to have one delivered, and we used to play the demos on them. I remember getting a demo of a video game called Darkseed. And Darkseed is really notable in the sense that it's a point-and-click adventure in the vein of something like, say, Monkey Island or Grim Fandango, that kind of thing, where you have to solve puzzles and put items together and stuff like that. But it's horror-based. It's actually inspired by the artwork of H.R. Giger. That's what and it's actually quite good. You play it now and you wonder how anyone could possibly have been scared by it, but you have to bear in mind, we hadn't seen anything like this before. It was our only exposure to horror in video games, and so it was really remarkable. I remember playing that, probably far too young, and being creeped the fuck out by it. You play a guy who's he's just inherited a house, like this really big house, from I think a deceased uncle or something like that, and there's something weird going on in this house. You find out that it's kind of like the interstice between our dimension and this really weird Lovecraftian extra-dimensional place that he accesses through a mirror. And the game starts with a nightmare, and it's really disturbing. It's based on H.R. Giger's art, but you see this guy like in this biomechanical machine that splits his forehead open and impregnates his mind with this alien embryo. And part of the game, he wakes up as you're controlling him, and he says something like, "I've got a splitting headache." And one of the things you've got to do is keep taking aspirin throughout the game and having showers which keep the alien embryo from erupting. You've only got so much time to do the game in, and if you don't do it within a set amount, I think it's a set amount of hours, then it's game over. The alien embryo erupts out of you, and that's the end of the game. The sequence by which the alien erupts from you is horrific. The imagery is really dark. I mean, it's H.R. Giger. So it's all of this kind of like uterinal and phallic imagery. There's imagery of impregnation, sexual imagery, which is married to biological horror and biomechanical horror. It's really cool. It's a bitch of a game. I mean, as anyone who played it at the time knows, it's impossible to do without a walkthrough. It is impossible to do without a walkthrough. There's a timing system in the game whereby if you're not in a particular place at a particular time, you miss stuff. Like, for example, there are deliveries to your door, and if you're not in the house at the right time, if you're in some other environment in the town, you miss it, and you miss essential artifacts and elements that you need to complete the game. And it's hilarious because the game doesn't stop after you've missed it. Oh, no, 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 no. It goes on. It goes on. It'll let you wander around until you just don't know what to do, and then you run out of time and you die. But what I remember about it is how impressive it was. Not in the sense that it was like technically impressive or anything like that, because it's not really, to be honest, but in the sense that it made a very profound impression on me. It showed me that horror was possible in video games, and sincere horror as well. It also, I mean, alongside the likes of Alien and Poltergeist 2 and whatnot, it also seeded my sincere and abiding adoration of H.R. Giger's work. I've always said with my own work, my own writing, if I can evoke a semblance, like an iota of the same emotions and the same feelings that come from H.R. Giger's artwork in my stories, then I will consider it a success, because they are beautiful. I mean, H.R. Giger's work is some of the most brilliant art I've ever come across. The engagement with it, the way it fascinates me is unique, I feel. It's something I've never really come across before, and it still is of its own today. It's idiosyncratic. I don't think there's anything quite like Giger, other than the stuff that Giger himself has inspired. But it was a formative moment. It was a formative moment. I remember, because we had the Amiga was in this cold little front bedroom of our house that didn't have any radiators in it, so it was freezing all the time, which is probably a good thing, because the Amiga ran at a bloody click, I can tell you. That thing, if you didn't, it suggested that you didn't play it for longer than so many hours, because it would literally burn out, like the power pack would burn out. It would get so hot that it didn't really matter. But I remember being in that little room on my own, playing this point and click adventure with my mouse, and being scared shitless by it as a kid, and loving it, being afraid to, like, go across the landing to go downstairs, but really loving this experience, just fermenting in my own fear and dread of clicking on the next screen or whatever. I never completed it because I was a kid and it was too bloody hard, but it was an amazing experience. There are others as well. Games like Alien Breed, for example. Alien Breed was supposed to be the official flagship Aliens game for the Amiga. The company that produced Alien Breed, which I believe was Team 17, I believe it was anyway, they had the Aliens license right up until the point of release, and then they realised something happened. It fell through or something like that, and they had to very quickly and very, very subtly alter it so that it didn't have any alien imagery in it. But it's still essentially an Aliens game. And you look at it now. It's a top-down action horror game where you go through a facility, you shoot the aliens, collect keys, open doors, solve puzzles, and whatnot. You look at it now and you wonder how anyone could possibly have been scared by it, but we were. We were, because we hadn't had those horror revolutions in video games yet. We didn't have the context, so we hadn't had Resident Evil, we hadn't had Silent Hill. On the consoles, which came later. I mean, later on, I got my Super Nintendo and I got my Mega Drive. There were horror games to a degree on those consoles. Again, they were not marketed as horror games by and large, but I remember getting with my Mega Drive a game called Echo the Dolphin, which most people won't remember as a horror game. You play as a dolphin, and it's really interesting because the dolphin moves like a real dolphin. There's something very sincere about the way it controls, and you have to rescue your pod, your family, effectively, from a group of aliens who have sucked them up in a vortex and are planning to devour them, along with lots of the other ocean life from Earth. But there are sequences in Echo the Dolphin that are really scary. Really scary, really disturbing. Again, the aliens are based on H.R. Giger aliens. They're designed to look like the H.R. Giger aliens, and the alien technology and world is derived almost exclusively from H.R. Giger's artwork. So there is this Disturbia element, and I remember feeling that when I was playing it. When I got my Super Nintendo, one of the games that made the biggest impact on me in narrative terms was Super Metroid. Those of you who had that game for the Super Nintendo in the mid-1990s, you just know. It was an amazing experience. We'd never seen anything like it. Metroidvanias, the games that we call Metroidvanias, as you know, fans of this channel and my other my Exaggerated Elegy channel will know, they're everywhere now. But it was Super Metroid that really coined them, and it is not only is it a beautiful example of storytelling, by the way, almost completely visual storytelling. There's hardly any dialogue in it at all, or text or anything like that. Everything's told visually and through atmosphere. It's also a really good example of science fiction horror. So at the beginning of the game, after the opening sequence, you as the character Samus Aran, you descend through the atmosphere of this planet in your spaceship called Zebes. And it's raining, and it's dark, and it's really evocative. There is this, like, strange soundtrack, which is, there's little chords of music, but there's also, like, these cracks of lightning, and cracking rocks, and thunder, and rain lashing down. And there's nothing there. There's nothing on the surface of the planet. It's barren. There's no enemies or anything like that. So you wander off to the left rather than to the right, which would have been standard in a side-scroller at the time. You wander off to the left and there's a cave. You go into the cave and it's all dark. Samus's visor turns on. There's like a light that comes out of it so she can see. And you can see these little alien bugs that are moving in the foreground, but nothing else. There's just these strains of eerie music and this sense of abandonment, and it's utterly brilliant. You make your way down through the layers and levels of this world, the catacombs that are underneath it, which are all abandoned. They're all shattered and broken from when Samus Aran was here in the original game. And eventually you find yourself spied by this monitor, by this sort of semi-organic camera that's in the wall. And then it kicks off. When you return through the areas that you've been through, the music changes. The music becomes much more threatening. And you find that the lighting has changed, and suddenly there are monsters. And it's really scary. It's really well played. There are set pieces like that all the way through the game that are narrative but have no exposition, that have no dialogue, that have no text. It relies upon the pacing of the game itself to tell this story, and it's utterly brilliant. I mean, it is such a wonderful form of storytelling that is almost unique to video games, by the way, and it's a form of horror that's very evocative because you feel as though you're in it, you feel as though you are part of it, you are immersed and you have some control over the situation. And it was, for me, it really was a formative experience, as formative, by the way, as reading those books that changed the topography of my mind, things like The Lord of the Rings and Weave World and, you know, whatever else came later. As formative as seeing those films that altered my preconceptions of cinematic narrative and informed my own imagination. And it's gone on like that. It really has. As this strange, like, Xennial generation of which I'm part has grown up, we've grown up with the technology. The technology evolves and ages as we do. It's really strange. So we went through our adolescence when video games went through their adolescence, and we experienced. I mean, it's hard to explain to people who were not born at the time what it was like when the 16-bit two-dimensional era of video games ended and transitioned into 3 dimensions and into 32-bit, when you suddenly had very cinematic video games with actors and dialogue and orchestral scores and whatnot. It was a quantum leap. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen. So when the likes of the PlayStation came along, suddenly we had Tomb Raider, which has a horror all of its own, by the way. There are sequences of horror in Tomb Raider that are really bloody disturbing. We had, of course, the establishment of horror as a viable subgenre of video games. We had Resident Evil. There were survival horror games before it. There were things like the original Alone in the Dark, for example, on PC, but they didn't reach a very wide audience because of their platform. Resident Evil came along, and it obliterated our preconceptions. It crashed through parameters of what video games were in a way that's very hard to explain now. It seems very cheesy when you look back on it now, the B-moviness of it, the crudity of it, but we were scared. We had never experienced this before. We'd never seen it before. When Silent Hill came along a few years later, that took ostensibly the same format and mechanics, but aged it up a little bit. It took inspiration, rather than from sort of zombie B-movies and science fiction horror B-movies, it took inspiration from the likes of Jacob's Ladder, Hellraiser, Clive Barker, psychological horror, supernatural horror, and suddenly we had this very adult form of horror in video games, and that changed everything. I remember having discussions with people at school about Silent Hill, and they were like, we couldn't get through this sequence. We couldn't get through the school, for example, because it was just too scary. It was a quantum leap, and that has happened again and again and again. We've had these new exposures and new experiences to new forms and formats of horror, and that hasn't stopped, by the way. That has continued as the technology has developed and as sophistication of storytelling and of the type of horror that's evoked in video games has evolved and effloresced into so many different subgenres and stripes and subspecies. It's unbelievable now. It's now a smorgasbord, especially in independent and small publishing horror. There is a form of horror in video games for everyone out there. There really is. It's a wonderful time, really, to be in video games right now for a horror fan. But it's amazing to me, it's an endless source of fascination to me, how that phenomena has fed my own imagination as it's developed and as it's changed over time, and continues to do so. I find that incredible. I really do, and it seems to have never stopped. It's an amazing thing. Anyway, thank you guys for listening to my rambles. More Our Lives in Horror coming very shortly. Until next time, bye bye.